Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all very well, and a very warm welcome to this Bath Masterclass. My name's Alistair Brandon-Jones. I'm a chaired professor in Operations and Supply Chain Management. I'm also the head of the Information Decisions and Operations Division. We have 4 divisions in the School of Management. So this morning, really my job is to give you a little bit of a flavour of a session that we might teach to a postgraduate or MBA group, so either a master's or a postgraduate group. And also there's an opportunity for you later in the morning to connect in and learn about the master's practice tracks, and also MBA summer projects and internships. So this is, I hope, an opportunity to kind of get a bit of a flavour for different aspects of the programme. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. But before I do, I just want to kind of give you a little bit of a flavour of what I guess we'll try and achieve in this 1-hour session. Clearly, it's a kind of condensed portion, if you will, of a larger session. Normally, lectures here at Bath are 2 hours for master's students, 3 hours or 3.5 hours sometimes for MBAs. And so I've kind of cropped down and reworked a session to kind of give you a flavour of some of the ways we teach. Secondly, of course, the elephant in the room is that we're all online, and therefore, that limits us somewhat to what we can or can't do, just like we've been dealing with, of course, in the last year. But I hope it will give you a sense of some of the activities and interactions that one might normally see, especially as we move to face-to-face teaching. So without further ado, let me share my screen and then we will make a start. Right, so let me make a start then. First off, what is this session about now? Well, what I'm going to talk to you about is customer-centric operations. And I really want to get inside the minds of customers. So we're going to cover 3 key elements within this session. The first is an idea of taking a DNA perspective on operations. The second is the way we can think about identifying gaps within our service and understanding why those gaps may be occurring. And thirdly, we're going to think about service failure and recovery, an area that I guess is really under-examined in a lot of management work. So let's ask a question for you. I want to get you kind of doing something straight away. I want you to think about what are the key elements of a restaurant service. Okay, so in the message board, I want you just to type in what are some of the key ingredients of a restaurant service. We think about, the speed of service, the quality of the food. What are the key elements here? So type your ideas into the Q&A, and then we can start building from that. Okay, so we've got some starting to come in now. Great. From Akash, we've got quality, we've got hygiene, so the cleanliness of the restaurant. We've got the communication between the service providers and you, the customers. The efficiency of the service. So is this service, you can have amazing food, but if you're waiting forever and ever, well, then you're going to get really frustrated. So the speed and the efficiency, and that will of course vary. Your expectations will vary based on the kind of restaurant you're going to. The staff and quality. Okay, so the quality of the food, the quality, the knowledge of the members of staff, for example, about what's on the menu and what are the ingredients, and is this suitable for vegans? Is this suitable if you have a paleo diet? Is this suitable if you are not eating meat, and so forth? So these are all sort of things we might need to understand. Terry talks about the idea of the overall experience. Okay, fair enough. In some ways you could say the overall experience is a summation of the ingredients that we're feeding in to a service. So if we think about this kind of idea of a DNA perspective, we're trying to break down that overall idea of experience into specific attributes, if you will. Almost think of this like a cake, right? You've got flour, you've got eggs, you've got milk, you've got honey, you've got jam, you've got icing, whatever you've got, depending on the nature of the cake, of course. these are the ingredients that ultimately go together. You mix them, you put them in your oven, and you deliver hopefully a really tasty cake. It's a similar kind of concept here. So the friendliness from Chloe, great. Behavior from Emma, the ambience, so the physical environment. So we're sort of combining, when we think about restaurants, aspects of what you, the customer, receive physically. You eat food, you leave, so you're transformed as a customer from empty to full, but you're also transformed psychologically from kind of unhappy to happy, let's say. So there are aspects there. Great stuff. The value for money from Bobby. So of course, all of these aspects of value, quality, speed, dependability, flexibility, all of those aspects are still connected then to what does it cost? So you have elements of deliverables against the cost, and the question of then, is it value for money? So some really good ideas there. Now, when we think about this idea of a DNA perspective, then we can think of it in terms of a transformation process, transforming materials, information, customers. Those are resources that we're going to transform in an operation, using transforming resources, be it staff, be it facilities, for example. So we take this idea of inputs of materials, information, of customers, of staff and facilities, and essentially we are combining those in a transformation process to deliver, hopefully, high quality services and products, hopefully products and services that are an appropriate speed, or an appropriate level of flexibility, or an appropriate level of dependability, or an appropriate level of cost. And if we can do that right, of course, then our operations do well. If we do that badly, our operations do less well. So operations management, in many respects, is about how do we get better at understanding things that are coming into our operation and manage the quality, speed, dependability, flexibility, cost of those inputs. How do we get better at managing the process of transforming them so that we have fewer errors, so that we process things through systems more quickly and effectively? How do we ensure that we offer the right kind of level of customization and so forth? Alongside aspects of the transforming resources. How do we ensure we've got the right capacity? How do we ensure that we've got the right kind of infrastructure, the right kind of IT? Should we invest in this new blockchain technology or not? Is that right for us just because other companies might be doing it? So understanding those things becomes really important. Building out from that, we can also think about service as a process. So those ingredients we just described for a restaurant, we can put them in essentially in order. I arrive at a restaurant. The first thing I see is the front of the restaurant, and I have an opinion, and I create an impression of it. I then work my way through to the check-in, and I have another opinion. I have a moment of truth, if you will, whereby I draw some kinds of conclusions about whether this is a restaurant I actually want to be at, or whether I want to turn around and leave. How long is that queue? How friendly is the first interaction? Then I go to my table, and again, I have an interaction there. Then I move through further, and I place an order, and I wait for my order, and I eat my food, and so on and so on. So as you work your way through a sequence, all of those elements together are in some way combining to generate satisfaction or dissatisfaction, or indeed, hopefully, delight. But it's a bit more complex than that. This sequencing effect actually creates some really interesting challenges for organizations. Because if, for example, you do something really great early on, let's suppose, for example, the waiter or waitress is super friendly and welcoming as you arrive, element 2 here, well, that of course helps generally improve the overall average satisfaction, but it does a bit more than that. Similarly, if we have aspects of the service that are poor, well, then, of course, the overall average is going to be down. So, for example, if I have to wait a long time to place an order, if the food arrives and there's an error, element number 4 here, if perhaps I end up having to wait a long time for my pudding, or I don't really like the pudding, or the pudding that I really would have liked isn't available, well, then again, I'm going to be dissatisfied. But at this point, we're sort of describing essentially adding up all of your perceptions of the different stages of a process, and then taking a kind of average score. Well, of course, in practice, it's a little bit more complex than that, because if I have a very bad experience early on in a process, I have to counter that with more really positive things. So essentially, in operations, we are always better fixing the big problems first than just delighting customers with elements of a service. Because the damaging effect, the negative effect of dissatisfying moments of truth are much greater than delighting moments of truth. So in a sense, we get that kind of counteracting effect going on here. Furthermore, we also have this issue. So this idea of the zone of tolerance essentially describes what is acceptable to a customer for each of the stages of a service process. And what you can see in this example is that first point is fine. It's in the zone of tolerance. The second point actually is a really positive, delighting experience. So as I said, maybe in the restaurant, we've given a really friendly welcome. We've shown a great deal of knowledge about the menu. We've started to understand very quickly the characters around that table as a waiter or waitress. Not only is that just good overall on average, but it also does something really important. It lowers the zone of tolerance down. What that basically means is I am now as a customer looking for reasons to be happy. I'm looking for reasons to be satisfied. Therefore, if we look at stages 4 and stages 7, I'm actually seeing them as better than they really are because the zone of tolerance has dropped. In a similar way, if you arrive at a restaurant or you arrive at a hotel and you wait for ages for check-in and nobody seems to care, well, then now you're looking for reasons to be unhappy. So you go up to your hotel room and you see that the bed is, not perfectly made. In the past, you might have said, well, never mind. But actually, you might have less tolerance to that. If you start to have elements which are previously satisfactory, for example, here, stages 3 and stages 5, now you're actually dissatisfied by those because of that zone of tolerance going up. So in larger organizations, we often have to factor in that customers' satisfaction is dynamic as they work their way through a process. All of the elements essentially are influencing the subsequent stages of a service process. What we're going to do now then is think about the second key question, which is when you are looking at your operation and you are thinking about the way in which the service is being delivered, one method that I've described just there to understand it is to break it down into its components, into its elements, that DNA perspective. And that's very useful because it allows us to get specific. You imagine speaking to a customer, right? I do quite a lot of consulting work, and you're speaking to a client and they might say, well, just generally, I'm not that happy. That's really not very helpful if you're trying to improve an operation, right? If you go to the supermarket and you're having an interaction with the manager and they say, what do you think of it? What we do? And you say, yeah, it's generally fine, or yeah, it's pretty good. Well, the follow-up question should always be specifically what? Specifically what is good? Specifically what don't you like about this particular service, this particular product, this particular operation? And so the DNA perspective really allows us to dig deeper. It allows us to say, of these different elements, which of them are less or more satisfactory to the customer? How are they having a knock-on effect through the rest of the service process? So building out from that, we can start to think about service gaps and why they occur. So I've got another little exercise for you here, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like you to tell me what you see, okay? So I'll give you 30 seconds to answer this question. What do you see? Okay, so Emma has said she sees a woman, all right. A woman, a lady, a side profile of a girl smiling. Okay, a lady with a feather in her hair. Okay, a lady with a headdress. Okay, a young woman. A girl wearing a feather hat, a glamorous lady with a feather in her hair from Chloe. That's a lovely description, Chloe. Thank you. Carry on. So some of you, I think, seem to be seeing a young woman. Other people perhaps don't seem to be seeing that. They seem to be seeing something rather older. Let's have a look. Let's carry on down. More answers coming into our Q&A. All right, a young woman looking sideways. A woman turning to the back. Okay, right. Interesting. A young lady coming through. Akash, thank you for your young woman looking sideways. Great stuff. Carry on. I've got a few more of you. Everyone on this call, type in what you see. Okay, a film star. Also an old woman with a big nose from Chloe. Okay, so Chloe is actually seeing two different women on this picture. Can you all see the old woman, ladies and gentlemen? Can you all see the young woman? A forest fire with smoke coming out from Vatsala. I like it, Vatsala. That is alternative thinking. Very interesting. An older woman with a fairly large nose from Fatin, a young woman smiling. I see an old woman, says Olivia, and says it in caps, which would suggest that she's convinced that there is definitely an old woman and maybe not so much the young woman. A woman looking towards the back with a jacket on, and a young woman, says Olivia. Okay, sorry, Olivia. Yes, you can see both. Fantastic. All right, interesting. An orange bird with a red beak. All right, interesting. So, you know, some people are seeing really quite different things entirely. That orange bird with the beak is a beautiful one. We can definitely see that once you start looking for it, right? Okay, right. I think we've got most of them coming through. All right, so look, we've got here quite a few different perspectives of the sort of 25, 30 people who've actually answered this. Some of you are seeing a young woman, right, facing away into the distance, a feather in her hair, red hair, quite elegant looking. Some of you are seeing an older woman looking side onwards rather than to the back, with a kind of long, slightly stubbly chin, a mouth, quite a big nose, and probably wearing a shawl. That light orange is probably a shawl. Some of you are seeing quite other things, smoke and fire. Some of you are seeing birds with beaks. What is important here? Why am I doing this? Well, this isn't just for a little bit of light humor. It's to make an important point, which is that when we are asking customers what they think of our service, people are just like you. They're seeing the same thing in very fundamentally different ways. And they see that same thing in different ways because of their own expectations differing, because their ages are different, because their genders are different, because their experiences of other services are different. And therefore they either expect more or less. They expect faster or slower. They expect more or less customizable. They expect higher or lower quality. They expect higher or lower cost, and so on and so forth. They're influenced by specifics of time. So the same customer will have a very different view of the speed of a service when they are in a hurry to get on with the rest of their day than when they're not in any hurry at all and they've got as long as they like. So even individual customers will be seeing different things. Thilani here sees Hulk, which I like as well. Nice one. Thank you, Thilani, for that. So when we ask customers about our service, we need to understand that diversity of opinion about the nature of the service. We need to think about, you know, in marketing terms, segmentation, but segmentation can often be quite simplistic because essentially it implies you have a type of customer you are all the time sometimes, rather than actually that we can vary based on times of day, times of the year, what we're doing. If I go on holiday with my family and use a plane, I have a very different set of expectations and perceptions of experience than if I am on a business trip using perhaps exactly the same airline, perhaps even exactly the same cabin. So, you know, these are things that we can start to think about around perceptions of service. And so that feeds into a little homework. Now, normally, if I was teaching and we had a 2-hour session, I would get you to do this activity, but we don't have that time today. But I can still, I hope, describe the point of this. So one way that we can start to think about gaps in service is to break down the elements that we described before from the DNA perspective of services. We can then start to position them in terms of how important they are to customers on average and what the performance is as seen by customers on average. And so what that allows, what that allows is to start to essentially take those individual elements of a service and position them based on relative priorities for improvement. So let me give you an illustration. of that. And what I want you all to do sometime this week is have a go at doing this. You could pick an operation that you're involved in working for and think about your customers and how you think they might be seeing your service, or pick one that you are actually receiving as a service. We receive literally thousands of services every single day. So just pick one and have a go at breaking it down through that DNA perspective and then positioning it on this matrix. This is called the importance performance matrix. Something myself and Nigel Slack developed when we were writing our books on operations and supply chain management. And essentially what we're doing is taking the ingredients and thinking about how important are they as seen by the customer, and what's the performance, again, as seen by the customer. So here, for example, for HSBC, we can see, for example, accuracy of transaction is phenomenally important. It's central to clients' notions of value. So it's a 1 in terms of importance, but it's also the performance is seen by these customers as really, really strong. The error rates are very, very low indeed. Similarly, staff knowledge here, so this is for kind of business client banking, is seen as very, very important. And also the performance is seen as pretty strong. Not quite as strong as accuracy, but a 2. So this is still well above benchmarks. Thirdly, we can think about something like staff friendliness. So staff friendliness is pretty important. It's not quite as important as knowledge, but it's still fairly high up there. And again, it's strong. Now, you can also see right across here, before I come to Watson and your question, translation services. So translation services actually for HSBC are pretty good, i.e. there are 3 in performance. And here we're scaling essentially 1 being very high performance right down to 9 very low. Sort of think of it almost like 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th ranked right down. But actually the importance is quite low. It's ranked, it's as a 7 in terms of importance. So in translation services, we essentially have overperformance. Now that means either HSBC are wasting their money doing something that isn't valued by customers, or they need to market that service more to increase the level of perceived importance to ensure that there's alignment. Otherwise, we're spending money unnecessarily. If you look on the other side of the equation, though, down here when we're looking at queues are seen as very, very important for customers who are using these services, whether they're using them physically in the client bank setups, or whether they are on the basically either phone or online conversations with their with the client bank managers. So the queues are very important, but the perception of performance is very poor relative to benchmarks. Now those benchmarks might be other business banks, they could be other kinds of queuing and service waiting settings. So sometimes when we're thinking about benchmarking, we're not just looking at our own operations. I remember looking at Singapore Airlines, and they were looking at the way in which they're assessing the quality of their business class food provision, for example. They stopped comparing themselves just to airlines because they're outperforming airlines, but let's face it, a lot of airline food is a bit rubbish. They started comparing themselves to high-end restaurants because actually that's what a lot of their clients are used to. The day before or the day after flying, they're going off to quite nice restaurants. So we can think about benchmarks beyond our industry. Now I'm just going to answer a couple of questions. So for this type of chart, can we only look at 2 aspects then, since we only have X and Y axis? That's absolutely right, Watson. And so, of course, when we're trying to assess service or we're thinking about prioritizing improvements, there are different dimensions that we might consider. And in this case, we're taking very much a customer perspective on it, a customer-centric perspective on operations, partly hence the title of this session, to think about basically what matters to our customer and are we delivering against it in their view. And of course, after that, we have a question. If we look at queues here, for example, we can see that there's a major problem. Essentially, it's importance of 2, performance of 7. That's a -5, if you will, right? So it's a major problem. And we're going to be causing overall dissatisfaction as a result of it. But what do we do about it? Well, we could throw tons and tons of capacity, which of course would be great for the perceptions of queues. They would improve, but of course our profitability might suffer. So there is always a tension here, folks, when we think about operations between how we could improve aspects of service as seen by the customer, but at the same time, the costs, be it staff time, be it investment in infrastructure, be it wasted capacity, the costs of actually improving service. So there is always a fine line to tread between giving everything the customer wants, but essentially being highly unprofitable, and not delivering what a customer wants and then losing customers. Will it be based on what is important or based on real life scenarios? I don't necessarily fully understand the question, but I'll have a go, Akash, at answering it. Essentially, you've got a couple of options when you look at an importance performance framework like this. Initially, we could essentially say, what do we think our customers view as important, and also how do we assess performance? And that may be possible initially because we may know our customers pretty well, we may spend a lot of time talking to them and engaging with them, and therefore we have a fairly good sense of A, what are the key ingredients of service, and then B, how do they view that service, right? However, often when you do this analysis, it's the process of doing it that's so useful, because it highlights, well, look, hang on a minute, when was the last time we actually asked these customers what they think of our service? Or hang on a minute, we know a lot about what they think of queuing, but we haven't ever actually asked them about their views on staff knowledge and friendliness, because it's not included in the survey. Or the focus group we ran last time was really all about the physical environment, and we didn't really get into some of this interaction stuff. So maybe we need to go and collect some data. Or how good is the data? Well, it's great for this group because they were always talking to us. We know exactly, let's say universities, we know exactly what our undergraduates think because they have lots of representatives and they're here for 4 years and they tell us a lot. But what about our postgraduate students? Well, we need to do more to really understand what they want. So the process of doing this and debating, actually, hang on a minute, I think differently to you, Akash, about this particular area, can really help us understand what we do and don't know about customers, what perhaps frontline employees often know more than managers. Some departments have fundamental misunderstandings about what matters, and that can be really, really useful in kind of driving consensus around how well we're doing and how we could improve. So hopefully that sort of answers your question. Yeah, so Rabia, sort of in a similar way, wouldn't every customer have a different importance level and, of course, different perceptions? Absolutely, Rabia. In fact, maybe I can illustrate that with this next one here. So I also was lucky enough to do something with Disneyland Paris a while back. And what was quite fun about that was the amount of data you can imagine Disney collect is huge, and there are all sorts of challenges in running their operations. And what one does essentially in this visual you're seeing here, and indeed the HSBC visual, is you're looking at the average of customers relative to each of these elements. So for example, the ride quality or the ride availability is on average seen as very, very good. The ride queues are on average seen as pretty good relative to importance to performance. However, there are differences, of course. So for example, we could have a situation where customers who went at busy times of year had a less good experience than those who went at a quiet time of year. Customers who go when it's sunny have a different perception of the queues because it's not unpleasant than when it rains. If you think about food quality, there are very big differences in opinions, particularly for Disneyland Paris, between UK and German customers on average had a more positive view of food quality, whereas Italians and Spaniards and French customers had a less positive view of food quality, which of course may say something about the fact that Italians and Spaniards and French people actually kind of know what really good food is, and therefore they were less positive about it. So to speak to your question, what one can do is you can start with an average, but then you can start to segment if you want. You could say, let's look at this importance performance matrix for Singapore Airlines first class, for Singapore Airlines business class, for Singapore Airlines economy class. Let's look at an importance matrix for holiday travelers and business travelers. And so you can start to understand how certain elements, there is a kind of consolidation of expectations, regardless of who you are actually as a customer. And others, there are really big differences. And that in of itself becomes really useful. Okay, I'm just having a quick look down at a couple of other ones. So yes, Fatin, for this chart, did you get the data directly from HSBC or based on the opinion of the importance for each factor and its respective performance? So this is coming essentially from combinations of data. And again, it's one of the advantages of something like an importance performance matrix, folks, is it allows you to collect different types of data to feed into what is essentially a strategic tool, right? It's not a precision tool like we can think about operations optimization. It essentially allows us to draw in information from a focus group, draw in information from an existing load of survey data, some observational data that we may collect ourselves as a consulting team, and so forth. And you start to sort of build around different elements, and you start to also, importantly, identify where you don't really know what the customer is thinking about. So what we see here is essentially a summary, folks, of what the importance performance matrix tells us in broad terms about a service, depending on where things are positioned. So if we have elements of our service that are up in that top right-hand corner, that is really where we have competitive advantage and sustainable value. Conversely, when we have elements in the bottom right-hand corner, that is where we have major problems. That is where we really need to think about improving, because the importance is high and our performance is low, as seen by the customer. In the middle is kind of a license to operate. And then up in that top left-hand corner, we can think of, is this a bit of an excess? Are we wasting resources on something that's not important to customers? Or is it an opportunity to really market the value of something that we do that others maybe don't? Another point to make about this all is, and it sort of links a little bit to comments around from some of you coming through, is not only are there differences in what customers think, but also they're constantly changing. Our expectations of a train service are always increasing, let's say. We expect now to have fast, reliable internet all the time in a way that before it might have been a bit of a bonus. So there's always a general trend from down towards that bottom right-hand corner, because our expectations are increasing and also our perceptions of what good performance looks like are reducing. And of course, if you're in very competitive environments, every time a competitor does something better, that will by definition reduce the perceived performance of what you're doing, even if your performance has remained the same, because of course the difference is worse. Okay, now we're going to move on to our third agenda item now, and that is to think about failure. And failure is something that really is often very much underlooked within operations. As I mentioned when I did the little video pitch before this session, it often feels like we're giving up if we acknowledge that failure is inevitable. Much of what I do in operations and supply chain management, whether I'm working with executives or doing consulting work or my research, is all basically about making operations better, making supply chains better, understanding how you can drive various new technologies into supply networks to improve the way they work and everything else. Understanding how behavioral aspects of operations are really critical rather than just technical aspects. So much of management schools, much of doing a degree, whatever you're doing, a master's or an MBA, is about learning how to do stuff better. But at the same time, failures are inevitable. They still will occur. And when they occur, we need to think about how we respond to them. And that's where we're going to start to think a little bit alike now. I want to introduce you to a little scenario, ladies and gentlemen. Now, hopefully you can all see a restaurant here. Now, you might be wondering why on earth I'm showing you this. This is my little boy Noah and George's Duplo. And if we were live in a class right now, rather than having a restaurant with Duplo, I would have at the front of the class a table and chairs, and I would bring a couple of you up to do a little scenario about failure. But of course we can't do that. So this is a good second best, I hope. So let me introduce you to the scene. Here, ladies and gentlemen, we have our protagonists. So this is Gunesh, my good friend, who is a professor in operations research. And this is his wife, Maria, who is also an associate professor in the School of Management as well. So Gunesh and Maria have been happily married for many, many years. They're very successful in everything they do. And they have decided to fly off to Singapore for a holiday, a well-deserved rest. And it's their wedding anniversary, of course, and they've come here to the Shangri-La Hotel in Singapore, very nice hotel, and they've come to the restaurant. So they arrive in the restaurant here, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, and I'll just bring this in a little bit closer. You can see it's a really high-end restaurant. Santa here at the back has brought his kids along. Nobody knew that Santa had children, by the way, but who knew? We've got a couple of ladies here who've come along for a nice dinner as well. And Ganesh and Maria, take a seat. And this is our waiter here, ladies and gentlemen. So. Hello, welcome, and I hope you're well. I hope you've had a lovely time at the Shangri-La Hotel. And what can I get you? Well, what have you got on the menu? We have some fantastic food, ladies and gentlemen, really, really tasty. We've got a wonderful bear steak. We have some wonderful pigeons. We also have some beautiful fish, all really delicious, all really locally sourced. You're going to love it. Well, I think, says Ganesh, I think I'm going to try this bear. I've not had that before. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, this is because I only have certain things with the Duplo pack. So it's not because we are supporting the cruelty to bears. Okay, so I'm going to go for the bear. Okay, what about you, madam? I think I'll go for the pigeon. That sounds nice. How would you like your pigeon cooked? I think I'll go for it rare, please. Okay, so rare is obviously not cooked too much. All right, so off goes the waiter and into the kitchen here. As you can see, this kitchen is very high end. It's got a KitchenAid and cooking away, working away, and out comes the food. So here we go. There is your bear, and there is your pigeon, madam. Here we go. I hope you enjoy. So one bear, one pigeon, lovely, and they can start eating their food. Unfortunately, at this point, we have a problem. As Maria is eating her pigeon, she realizes it's not being cooked rare, it's actually being cooked a bit too much, it's overdone. So my question is, what can she do? So type into the message board again, her options. What can we please do for Maria and this situation? What might she do? Okay, so Bobby suggested maybe asking for a replacement. Ardesh asked for a new dish. Thank you, Ardesh. You could ask to get it replaced. Call the waiter and complain. Send it back to the kitchen, says Ryan. Okay, great stuff, Ryan. Thank you. Talk to the waiter. Inform the waiter. Ask them to recook. Do nothing, says Chloe. Complain to the manager. Right. So, in a sense, in simple terms, we've got two options here, folks. We've either got the option that she does something or she doesn't. And there's an irony here. A lot of customers, when they have something they're not happy with, they don't actually say anything at all, which is in of itself a major problem. But let's assume that she does. She's going to put up a hand and she calls the waiter. So over comes the waiter. Hello, madam. Are you enjoying your food? Well, unfortunately, it's a little bit overdone. I'm sorry about that. So what can the waiter do at this point? Well, let's assume the normal. So the normal might be that he would just take away her food and redo it. So that's what he does. So off he goes. He takes away the pigeon and he talks to the chef in the background here and says, chef, you need to cook another pigeon. That one wasn't done quite right. Now, in the meantime, what can this couple do? What does Ganesh do? He's got his bear nicely cooked, ready to eat. What are his options? Type your ideas in for what his options are, please. So Ardesh got a nice idea. You could serve them a complimentary dish to keep them busy. Because at the moment, the problem here is that actually, what is Ganesh going to do? He's got his bear, nice and hot and yummy and ready to eat. And either he's going to eat his food or he's going to wait until Maria's food comes back. If he eats his food, it's a bit awkward. He could share it, of course. But of course, then Maria might not actually fancy bear, frankly, but he could do. So either he's going to eat it, like Akash has said, or he could share it, like Ryan suggested, or he could simply wait. But if he waits, then it's going to get cold. If he eats it, he's going to feel guilty, and it's going to be a disappointing experience for them both, because then ultimately Maria's going to eat her food on her own as well. Remember, this is a nice wedding anniversary meal. It's meant to be special. Or they could share it. Well, Maria didn't really want bear in the first place, so why would she want to share it? So it's really unsatisfactory. So as an alternative, if we kind of roll back and we run that scenario again, when Maria complains about her pigeon, what are our alternatives instead? Let's fire some ideas about what could we do that instead of just simply recovering to the bare minimum, we actually do something a bit better. Okay, let's have a look coming through. Got lots and lots of ideas coming through here. Okay, we could offer some free snacks. We could send his bear to the kitchen and come back later, says Thalani. Great one. Yeah, really good. So we could essentially, the waiter could take them both. Saffron says the waiter could offer some free side snacks or drinks. Nice idea. Okay, so let's try that then. So the waiter says, look, I'm really, really sorry. So bear in mind, an apology is often the most critical part of any kind of service failure recovery, just getting that empathy in. So I'm very sorry. Let me take away both your main courses. I'll make sure they're cooked properly for you. And in the meantime, let me bring you some kind of in-between dish. So, maybe a free drink. There we go. There's our free drink. Maybe some snack while you wait. So, this could be a amuse-bouche, a little nibble that you can have while you're waiting. Now, what does that do? Essentially, it starts to recover in a way that isn't going to lead to another level of dissatisfaction. And that's the problem. Often when we look at recovery in services, companies do the very bare minimum, and effectively what they're doing is they're not fully compensating you for the inconvenience. If your product is faulty, you've been inconvenienced because you've had to call them, you've had to wait for a replacement. So if you just get a replacement, it's not really sufficient recovery to delight you. It's not even really quite to satisfy you. So you're still going to feel somewhat disappointed because you've essentially not had the service right first time, or the product right first time. Whereas as we start to build here, what we've got is a couple who were disappointed, of course, the failures occurred, but now we've done something for them to really bring them back to level. Now, is there anything we could do that would really go the next mile, that would really ensure that Ganesh and Maria leave this restaurant not just kind of happy-ish, but super delighted? What could we do? Give me some ideas. So Akash said we could discount the entire meal. Okay, so we could give them a discount. Yeah, absolutely. We could offer them some kind of free puddings. All right, great. Yeah, so we could say at the end of it, we could say, right, look, you don't have to. Sorry for the scale here, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, working with kids' toys is always a challenge. But we could say, look, this cake is on us. It's a special one for you. In fact, technically, Zoe's made the point. We don't just have to offer it as a discount. The whole meal. We could say, look, this meal is on us. It's free. Now, the question then would be, how would we make that decision? Essentially, how big a recovery could we have? Yeah, so we could have somebody come out while they're waiting for their food and play them the guitar to keep them amused. So it doesn't always have to be physical things. It could be experiential things. It could be levels of apology. It could be the manager coming out. It could be the chef coming out to say, oh, I'm sorry about the error. I'll look into it and make sure it doesn't happen again. So there are lots of ways in which we can think about failure and about recovery. Now, I'm just going to carry on looking down complementary dishes. Often an apology, Ramin, has got a really good point. We can offer an apology, give them a gift certificate along with a replacement and a discount. We're starting to really get into recovery to delight here, because we're engaging in the idea of the empathy. We're also engaging in the idea of some kind of discount or free meal. Also, maybe starting to think about, okay, how do we get them back in this restaurant so they can have a really great experience another time? Lots of really great ideas. So thank you for sharing those. So I'm now going to share my screen again with you, ladies and gentlemen, in order to carry this idea on a little bit further. So the complaint value chain really speaks to this idea of what we should be doing when it comes to understanding failures and what it means for failures to occur. So what you can see here is essentially a sequence by which failures occur, complaints do or do not happen, satisfaction occurs or doesn't occur, and people leave or stay. And these percentages partly come from various bits of research looking at switching behavior or looking at complaint satisfaction levels and so forth. But actually, what matters more is what happens when we change them. So if you just assume that for a mythical company, if you will, that this was their reality, that they had a 20% failure rate, of which 60% did complain, about 40% didn't complain. Of those who didn't complain, about 80% leave, about 20% stay. Of those who do complain, about 75% are satisfied, 25% are not, and so forth. What we can do is we can start to put some numbers on that. So if we think about the cost of a lost customer, I can't show you this clip, sadly, because of copyright, but I can, I guess, illustrate something. So, when we think about how much does it cost when we lose a customer, when we frustrate a customer, we often think about in the here and now. So you think about our restaurant example. In that restaurant, what were Ganesh and Maria worth to us? Well, initially we might say, well, they were worth the meal. That was all they were worth, really. Just that's the cost of the meal, the profit margin of the meal. But of course, they're worth more than that. Because as I mentioned before, Ganesh and Maria are really successful. They maybe travel off to various other Shangri-La hotels around the world 2, 3, 4 times a year. And so what they're worth isn't just in that one meal at the Shangri-La that night, let's say the $150 profit margin. They're actually worth the whole stay at the Shangri-La times by maybe 4 times a year, times by maybe 20, 30, 40 years of business. So you could very quickly get from $150 in your mindset to $500,000 in your mindset when you start thinking about their value as a couple from a lifetime spending perspective. Then, of course, importantly, Maria and Ganesh have friends who listen to them, who are interested in their opinions. And so if they have a great experience at the Shangri-La, that will influence some of their friends to also use that service. And similarly, if they have a bad service at the Shangri-La, that will influence them not to. So that kind of networked effect, that network value is very hard to calculate, but it's very often at least twice as much as your own value. Because if you think about, if you have a good experience or a bad experience, how many people can you tell right now? You can tell close friends, maybe most of you will have something like 10 to 15 genuinely close friends who really listen to what you have. So you can tell them, but you can also kind of tell the world via LinkedIn or Twitter or Weibo or whatever it might be. And so all of those issues really influence. And none more so than an example that I've just posted in the chat around United Brakes guitars. So, back now in 2019, United Airlines flew this guy here with his guitar on United Airlines, and they broke it. And he complained, and they didn't do anything about it. And so he wrote a song. So after a year of complaining and trying to fight his battle, he wrote a song and said, look, you know what, if you're not going to fix it, I'm going to write a song and I'm going to post it on this thing called YouTube. Now, 10 years ago, YouTube wasn't as big as it was now. And the company said, yeah, fine, go ahead. And so he sang a song, and I will try and share some of it with you just to keep you amused. I flew United Airlines on my way to Nebraska. The plane departed Halifax, connecting in Chicago's at O'Hare. While on the ground beside me, a passenger said from behind me, my God, they're throwing guitars out there. The band and I exchanged a look, best described as terror, at the actions on the tarmac and knowing whose projectiles these would be. So before I left Chicago, I alerted 3 employees who showed complete indifference towards me. United, you broke my Taylor guitar. United, some big help you are. You broke it, you should fix it. Or liable, just admit it. I should have flown with someone else or gone by car. 'Cause United breaks guitars. And so it goes on, ladies and gentlemen, for 3 more verses. So I'll let you watch it in your own time. Now, you might think, well, that's kind of just a funny story. An annoyed customer decides to post their frustrations. However, it made a massive difference, right? It made a massive difference because this was viewed by over 20 million people on YouTube over the subsequent years. Within around 3 days, United Airlines had seen a 10% share drop, around 180 million, and that was 10 years ago, in lost share value as a result directly of this particular social media storm. It also, of course, highlights that social media, we've become really aware of how things can go viral. Back then, that wasn't really understood. Now, a second thing that I'll also get Danielle to post into the chat box for you to have a look at after this session is, I guess, a more sinister event that happened more recently, 2017, with United Airlines, when they dragged a passenger off the plane. And here it was interesting because not only was it the incident itself that was deemed a failure by many watching and by those around the world who saw the various recordings of this, but also the response was seen as a really poor response. Initially, United Airlines blamed the passenger for this incident, and as a result, it really did them a lot of damage. In this case, within 3 to 4 days, somewhere between 500 million and 1.2 billion dollars, depending on which financial analysts you trust, were wiped off the value of United Airlines as a direct result of this particular incident. So when you get it wrong, if you don't understand those risks, it can really go badly wrong. So building out from that, if we put some numbers on this, if I've got 5,000 services being delivered and I have a 20% failure rate, that's 1,000 failures I'm dealing with. Well, if we assume the percentages as you see here, 530 customers are lost to me. Now, if each customer might actually be worth 100,000 as a lifetime value and a network value, right? And that could be quite likely, even for quite small businesses, like, you know, you going off to a local cafe. You just do your sums. You think about a local cafe that you regularly go to pre-lockdown, right? You might be going 4 or 5 times a week, spending, you know, £5, £10 a time. It all adds up. And now you add to that the fact that you also go with your friends. And if you choose not to go, maybe they don't go as well. And then if you post something on Twitter about how rubbish your service is, that's going to have a negative effect as well. These numbers can get very big very quickly. So what if we improve the way in which we deal with those complaints? And there are lots of ways we could do that. And so in that scenario I shared with you about the restaurant, essentially what we are trying to do as a business is move from a mindset that is recovery to the bare minimum to recovery to something that looks more like a delight, really go above and beyond. And the reason we do that is because if we can increase the satisfaction levels of those who complain, in this case, we've moved it from 75% to 83%. The number of lost customers will reduce, in this case, from 530 to 501. Now, if I've just done an estimate that says we have an estimate that the value of each customer is 100,000, well, then you do the maths and you can see why recovering to delight might make financial sense. It's why a lot of CFOs quite like this model, because you can put estimates on costs of lost customers, value of retained customers, costs of doing these changes, and decide basically if it's financially makes sense. So to build on this idea of how do we recover to delight, we can think about something called justice. And justice in service operations really speaks to 3 elements. Distributive justice is what I give you. Procedural justice is the process you have to go through to get what I give you. And interactional justice is the empathy, the communication I show. So if we think about our restaurant, if eventually I give you a free meal, that's distributive justice. But if to get that free meal, you have to fill out a 6-page form and then have to wait for a month for me to decide, that's very poor procedural justice. If I show lots of empathy during a complaint episode, that's high interactional justice. If I have a process that's actually quite straightforward, but I show no care, then that's lower interactional justice. So of course, in an ideal world, what we are trying to achieve is a simple process that shows care and empathy and that distributes value to the customer in a way that takes them beyond simply neutral and actually makes them delighted. And if we do that, that really helps. But another thing we can think about is not simply satisfying those that tell us they're not happy. It's also actively seeking out complaints, or indeed seeking out feedback, if you want to put it in a slightly more positive light. And so when we're seeking out feedback, in this case, we've increased the proportion of those that tell us they're not happy. So we had 1,000 people experience some kind of service failure, and now 700 of those are telling us. Now we could do that in lots of ways. We could do that by being more proactive and asking, are you happy? We could do that by not waiting in the restaurant for the person to have their mouth full before we say, is everything all right? And them saying, oh yeah, it's fine. But actually asking them directly about what they like or maybe what they're not so keen on with the service. All sorts of mechanisms that you could maybe start to think about. If you simplify the process, just simplify the process of complaining, of giving feedback, it will make a massive difference. A lot of companies will report that they have seen reduced levels of complaints, and they will report that as a good thing. Now, sometimes it is a good thing. It's a sign that the quality of service has improved. Sometimes it is not a good thing. Sometimes it is because customers have simply given up complaining because it's too much work. It's too much stress. It takes too long. And customers, like in every other setting, will just do a cost-benefit analysis, subconsciously perhaps, and say, you know what, for what I'm going to get, I can't be bothered to complain. And the worry, of course, is that those customers are typically lost to us. So a counterintuitive point here is that many companies see complaints as a cost center, i.e., well, we don't really want to encourage people to complain because it will cost us money, but actually complaints are a profit center. If we get more people to tell us they're not happy, we have an opportunity to satisfy them, and therefore we have an opportunity to make them stay, make them champions of our business. And so there is a financial incentive to encourage feedback from our customers. So a final homework that I would get you to think about on your own, but also maybe chat to your friends or your family about this one, is think of a failure that you have experienced recently. Think about how you went through this journey, this complaint value chain. Did you complain or not? We still know a very large proportion of customers who experience failure don't complain. So did you complain? If you did, why? Was it because it was easy? If you didn't, why didn't you complain? If you did complain, well, what happened? Were you satisfied? Did you feel that the process was dealt with effectively or not? How could it have been improved? And what was the overall outcome? Did you leave that company and go to other companies? Did you stay? Sometimes we are hostage customers. We're really unhappy, but we still use that service, not because we want to, but because we feel we have no choice. And that's a very risky thing for businesses to play into, because they might assume you're captive, but as soon as those dynamics change, which of course often they do over time, monopolies get broken down, it becomes easier to have choices. As soon as that happens, customers who are essentially hostages to your business will leave, and they will leave in droves. So I would encourage you to think through that element. And of course, finally, we can think about how do we just design out failure in the first place. So if we can stop the failure through all sorts of operations improvements, well, then of course we will see even fewer customers leave. The message there is, it is always better to get things right first time if possible. And so we are thinking about how we recover from failure, but also thinking about how we stop making these failures again and again and again. So finally, if we think about combining all these small improvements together, they can make a massive difference. If I've just encouraged a slightly higher proportion of people to tell me they're not happy, I've dealt with those slightly better. I've actually reduced the failures in the first place slightly. You add those all together and you move from, in this case, 530 lost customers to 406 lost customers. That's 124 more customers with their lifetime value that might be really very substantial that we can consider. So these can really be really big differences from quite small improvements along the complaint value chain. So what does this tell us? It tells us that as operations, we need to really understand the value of retaining customers, not just their value in the moment, in that restaurant, that meal, that profit margin, $150, let's say, but actually their total value over the lifetime of that customer and their networked value across all of those who they influence. Because if we understand that value of retention, or indeed the cost of a lost customer, we have essentially an incentive structure to drive improvement. Secondly, we need to think about how do we improve the way we handle complaints, from doing the bare minimum to really delighting customers, really going above and beyond, because it's almost always money and time well spent. Thirdly, we need to think quite counterintuitively for some businesses, how do we encourage complaints? How do we seek out problems? And then finally, We need to think about how do we stop the failures occurring in the first place. And the beauty of dealing with complaints more professionally is that the more data you get from those who are unhappy, the more you work with them to improve their satisfaction, actually, the more information you have to drive out the failures in the first place. So some final thoughts then to wrap this session up. Are you taking a DNA perspective when you're thinking about service, breaking the elements down of the services that you deliver? And why is that useful? It allows us to really tease out this overall perception of satisfaction, to really identify what is it that people love and what is it that people are not happy about. What are the priorities for improvement? Are you then thinking about this gap perspective? Because essentially customer satisfaction is driven by the gap between what people expect and what they think they're getting. It's called the disconfirmation paradigm. It's driven in that way, and therefore as expectations evolve, then those gaps evolve. As competitors create new services that are better, that will change the dynamics. So are we understanding how gaps might be forming between customer expectations and perceptions of performance? And then finally, are we really paying attention to failure and seeing it as, in a sense, an opportunity to do things very right a second time, and an opportunity to learn to improve our operations more broadly? So thank you for your time in this 1 hour sort of mini lecture masterclass. I hope it's given you some kind of flavor for what, how we think, I guess, at Bath in some respects, how we might approach kind of different sort of setups and topics. Of course, I think it's important to reiterate that when you are in the physical class, one, because we have more time, and two, because of the nature of the physical setup, there tends to be a lot more in the way of exercises and breakout groups and everything else. But at the very least, I hope it's given you a flavour for the way we approach teaching here at Bath. So thank you all for your time today. I hope you found it interesting and engaging. It's hopefully given you some food for thought about dealing with services in a bit of a different way, and particularly also dealing with failures in a different way as well. I hope many of you decide to come to Bath. If you do, the best of luck with that process, and with a bit of luck in the world, I will look forward to seeing you in person at some point down the line as I teach on MBAs or MSc programs. Thank you for your time.